I just want to do a little bit more of a deep dive on this stuff. The important part to know is that there's a couple of different ways of doing many-to-many relationships. There's a couple different flavors, like I said. There's a link down here that Microsoft has actually provided for many-to-many relationships. In there, they go into 3 different scenarios. So let me just describe a couple of them. One is when we're talking about many-to-many using dimensions. If anybody is unaware, dimensions are a way that we want to describe our business processes. So it contains all the details that you would use to describe, say, transactions. Where did this transaction take place? Who made the transaction? How much? Or sorry, not how much was it? When was it? The who, what, when, where. The why ends up being on the fact tables themselves. So when you're talking about joining dimensions together, the example that almost everybody uses and is included on that link there is the idea of a, let's go back one. I don't want that one. Is the idea of a bridge table between 2 things. So say we had accounts for a bank, and those accounts had many different customers or owners. So one account can be owned by more than one customer, and one customer can own more than one account. So that's why it's got this little symbol in the middle here of one to many to one. So you got one account to many being the bridge table, and one customer on the other side. Generally, the way you handle this type of situation is using the bidirectional filters or the DAX cross filter function. The reason that most people would use this DAX cross filter function is if anybody has slightly older versions of SQL analysis services. I believe it came out in 2012 with the original version of the Vertipack engine. This is one of those situations where you should not use the many-to-many relationship type in Power BI. It's really important, and we'll get into what it is actually for in just a second for us. But the actual purpose of this is when you want a single fact row or a single transaction to appear on multiple rows of a slicer. And I'm just going to talk about these things, and then I'll go into some specific demos. The next one that we've got here is relating a fact table to a dimension that is of a higher grain.
Is now joining.
So oftentimes you'll have, say, a fact table that is not at the same granularity that you capture your dimensions at. For example, if we have a dimension that is about our products, and we've got one row per product in that dimension, but we have a budget table that is capturing one row per subcategory, which, there's a subcategory contains many products. You would use something like this because we're actually the fact table of the budget is at a higher granularity than what's available.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Than what's available in the dimension. So again, this can use the exact same functionality that we had in the previous many-to-many dimensions. So you can use a bridge table if we want. We can use bidirectional filters, the cross filter function. We can actually create a virtual relationship between these tables, and I'll show an example of that as well. So we don't actually have to have a physical relationship between those tables. But this is the one where you would want to use a many-to-many relationship within Power BI. It is quite efficient to use. So, we'll get into some of the limitations in a little bit here, but it is a good one to use. So this is when your fact table doesn't align with the lowest level of grain in your dimension table. The last one that we do have that that exists and is described in that document that's provided by Microsoft is you can relate fact tables together. I highly, highly, highly recommend not doing that. Rework your model into a dimensional model or more of a star schema. It ends up not being very functional, and you end up running into a number of different issues. So just talking a little bit more of the specifics of that first scenario where we're working with many-to-many dimensions. This is going to be the physical database model that we would end up having. So in our account table, so we've got the account table over here, we've got the customer table over here. We usually have one row per entity. So there's going to be one row per account or one row per customer over on this side. And then in between them, we've got a bridge table here. So I'm sure you guys can already see the issue that we'd end up running into is that if we ever want to do anything with this transaction table on the left-hand side, it can be filtered by this account table because it actually uses the relationship. A filtered context passes through this using the arrow, but when we look between the account table and the
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Between the account and the account customer table, we end up running into a little bit of an issue because the filter context is only going in one way. So if we were to actually want our filter context to pass through from the customer to the account customer table to the account table to the transaction table, we need to actually handle this relationship in both directions. So let's just show how this can actually take place. So here's the physical model. Really, really simple way of doing that is you just want to double click on that relationship that acts between these two tables and change this to both directions. It's incredibly simple. And let me just show what these end up looking like. So up here, I have my transactions. I've just created there's a transaction amount. So we just want to auto sum these together. Do that. We'll make this a little bit bigger so that people can actually see what I'm talking about here. So right now there's $275 worth of transactions in there. If I look at this by account, no problem. I can see $75 in account 1 and $200 in account 2. However, let's just undo what I did with that single relationship first. If we look at this by a customer, it's going to not work because when we look at customer, that relationship stops at the account customer table. It cannot travel through our relationship here. So we change that to have this be bidirectional. Say okay. This will quickly update there. And now we actually can have this work. Customer 1 has $75 associated to them. Customer 2 or 92 has $275. And that's because the account that has both $75 and $200 associated with it belongs to both customers there. So you can see if we were to break that down, it's count 1, count 2, 91, 92. The other way, if you guys do have an older version of analysis services and you don't have this bidirectional relationship available to you, because I know there's some people that come to these user meetings that use analysis services 2014 and possibly 2012. You can get around this by using the cross filter function. Let's go in here and I'll just quickly make this a little bit bigger. So it's very simple. You just want to say, I want to do a sum, same thing as your base measure, and you just call out the cross filter using both endpoint columns of that relationship. Right, and this will work in the exact same way as if we had a bidirectional filter. All right. So let me just go back to this. This is that's really easy for that to function that way. Another way that this can actually take place, you don't always need a bridge table. Oftentimes, you can actually have a dimension table that acts as if it were a bridge table. So in this case, I've got my finance table on the left-hand side. Again, very, very similar scenario. Those finance transactions take place within an account, and I've got those accounts in multiple different hierarchies. So I've seen this with a number of different organizations that have their income accounts in both a balance sheet hierarchy and an income statement hierarchy. So we can do handle this in the exact same way. So let me just go to our finance tables there. I've already got the bidirectional filter set up. I'll just get rid of that for now because I want to do this in more of a matrix type visual. So let's just look at the finance amounts there. I've just done this for the sake of it being a little more visible to us. We've got our finance accounts. Let's just look at what those accounts look like. You know, each one of these accounts has the specific amounts broken out properly. But down here, we've actually got a revenue account and an expense account. Those accounts belong in both our income statement and our balance sheet hierarchies. So if I get rid of that account for now, and I'll go to my my hierarchies, I'll just show you what level 1, 2, 3, and 4 look like on here. So you can see as we go over time, we've got our income statement or our revenues and expenses showing up in there. And if I were to open up the balance sheet, you'll see that we've got in expenses and revenue showing up in the retained earnings part of that balance sheet as well. So this is the exact same situation. We want a transaction line to show up on more than
Unknown
one
participant is now
value bar
exiting.
slicer. All right. So that's many-to-many dimensions. I guess we're just showing this exact same thing. And this is the way we would handle these things. So I'll do the same thing that Rez is doing. I'll just share this this presentation with folks. So the big thing is you set the bidirectional filter to be both directions because it's going from, we're filtering from one table and making sure that it can filter all the way through to our fact table. Lastly, when we want to go to our a higher granularity table, there's a couple of different ways that we would want to handle this. So there's the technique of snowflaking out. We could take the column that defines our higher grain of the dimension and set that up in the exact same way that we did our dimension. Or in this case, we can actually use the many-to-many relationship. And in my opinion, this is the only place that you would, or the only situation you would want to use that many-to-many relationship, where you have a higher granularity that is taking place. And I'll show you the virtual relationship in just a second. But in order to set this up, let's go back to my my Power BI model here. Get rid of that table for now. So here's the reseller. You can see we've got our product table there. We've got our date dimension there. And here's my budget amounts. Budget amounts are at the year month level and the subcategory level. So if I want to make sure that these connect, I can actually go down to my my year month column of my dim date and connect these together. And you'll see we're going to get a nice pop-up here that's actually asking us how we want to model this out. So this relationship has cardinality of many-to-many. There's significantly different behavior, blah, 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 blah. You know, here's where you can go to learn more. When using this type of functionality on the cross-filter direction, I almost always say to only filter in a single direction and always going from the dimension to the fact table in this case. So I'm just going to click on that. So this means that filters will go from our date table to the budget table. So if I were to filter to just a single year, it would filter the budget table. If I were to filter my budget table for one way or another, it does not necessarily. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure who's talking there. One sec. Sorry, I just muted everybody. So there we go. Where was I? Yeah. So this is saying that if our budget amount table is filtered, it does not necessarily filter our date table. This is definitely the way we want things to operate in this case. So we'll see that a relationship is created there, going from the many side to a many side there. You can see there's a little star on both sides. And then if we were to actually, we could technically do the exact same thing in this case, going from our product table to this one, and say from our, so that will function just perfectly fine. If we were to filter down to a lower level grain, we could encounter some incorrect data, but I would just use DAX to kind of filter out some of those behaviors. When you're creating a second many-to-many relationship, it automatically sets it as inactive. So you do have to make sure that you set it to active in that case. I'm just going to get rid of this because we can also set this up in the exact same way that we had previously. Doing that way, and then so we have to make sure that our filter context can flow from our dim product over to subcategory to budget amount, meaning we have to handle this relationship right here. You just turn that into a bidirectional filter. And now this will go from product all the way over to budget amount. They function in the exact same way. And if I use that cross filter functionality, they function in the exact same way as well. So let me just show you guys one additional part of that. So let's just take a look at what happens when I look at my reseller sales here. So let's go reseller sales. Let's change that to a table. And we're just going to go to my product and subcategory name. All right. So we can see that this is actually functioning correctly. So this is going through. If we were to go drill that down a little bit further, this wouldn't necessarily work properly. So even though I am getting different numbers on that bib short, it's not actually let's change that to there. So those are not necessarily the way we would want those numbers to show up. Because if I look at my my budget amounts table, we've got subcategories on here, and we've got some numbers showing up, but it doesn't really function together properly there. And I apologize if anybody can hear a crying child in the background. 2-year-olds, so it goes. The way we would actually want this to function for us, let's go back to this category name, because this is actually supposed to be just our bikes. Let's go and include our budget amounts there. So now we've got this amount being shown multiple times in the same way. So if you've actually filtered down to a specific product, it's not showing up correctly. So you could create a couple of different schemes. If you want it to be, a percentage of this based off the previous year sales, you could write some DAX to handle something like that. It ends up being, not perfect, but there's definitely a couple of different ways to handle that. Let me show you the last way to actually handle this relationship, and that's by using a virtual relationship here. So if I were to get rid of these two amounts there, or these two relationships there, there's no real way, or no way technically that, or I should say automatically, that our product dimension will filter this budget amounts table. If I go back here, get rid of my sales amount because I don't need it right now, and we'll just filter on bikes. I'm just going to drill in there for a second. There we go. So right now, there's these are not actually filtering across the board. So if I want to create a relationship just virtually in here, if I don't have access to play around or manipulate my model, similar to what Reza was showing before. So if you're a visualization person and you can't actually go and manipulate the model, you can use DAX to create virtual relationships. So I'm just going to go my virtual budget amount, and we're going to it's going to be calculate. Calculate is the most important function within Power BI, so always use it in that way. It's going to be the sum of that budget amount column. And in order to use or in order to create a virtual relationship, we're going to use the function called treat as. And what you want to do is I want to treat whatever dimension column that I want to reference as whatever column in my fact table I want to filter. So in this case, it's that dim product. Where is my treat as dim product? Sorry, I had this before. Why is my IntelliSense not actually showing up there? Oh, that's why, because I'm not actually using a table. Okay. So we want to actually pull the values out of that dim product. This is going to be the subcategory key because I do have a way of filtering other columns by that subcategory key. This is going to filter the budget table on the subcategory. Make sure that that's formatted in a reasonably nice way. So even though I don't have a physical relationship between these, if I were to actually pull these on here and take a look at that, now you can see that my budget table is getting the correct context from my product table. Still suffers from the exact same problem. If I were to go down to a lower level granularity, you'd have to handle those types of things. But there's different ways that you would want to handle something like that. Like I said, this is really useful when you don't have direct access to manipulate the model, but you can still write DAX. So that ends up being very, very powerful in that way. I think that is it that I wanted to show about that. I know we're running a little bit over time there. Are there any questions that came through during that?
Jared, we're spot on time, so you can take questions if you want.
All right. There was one other thing I actually did want to show you guys as well. Let me just go back to my model. This is not necessarily a many-to-many problem, but it's a case where I have, so I've got a finance table here. So it's got amounts. Those amounts are associated to a specific date, and they're also associated to specific organizations, and those organizations have currencies, and we have a currency exchange rate. So basically this currency exchange rate is, we've got one rate per day per currency. And if I were to need to translate my currency rates from a finance table, there isn't really an easy way to do that just using relationships. So I did want to show something along those lines here. So let's just see what happens if I were to go, I'm going to create a quick matrix here. We'll add the dates on there. I'm going to add the currency across the columns there, and I just want to bring my finance amounts in here. So you'll see, let's just make that nice and big. Hopefully you guys can see that. So we've got Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, euro, and US dollars. Each of these are stored in their local currency. In order for us to translate this, if I needed to get what is my total value of dollars in US dollars, I would need to take each one of these values, multiply it by the daily currency exchange rate, and then sum those values up. So this ends up being a fairly common thing that I've seen out there, especially with working with multinational companies. So companies that operate in both US and Canada have this exact same thing very, very often. So we've got the way we would want to handle this is by making sure that we are doing a calculation on every day with every currency. So how do we do that? We actually would want to create a table that has every day and every currency. So this is going to be a SUMX function. I'm sure some people have played around with this stuff, but because those two tables, our currency table and our date table, are separate, there's no relationship between them. We would need to create that table that cross joins them, and fortunately, there is a function called cross join. So if we were to cross join our dim date and our dim currency, this would create a virtual table that has context for 1 day per day per currency. And then all we would want to do is on each day, what are we calculating? And then the end value is actually summed up and returned to us. So every day, I want to take the sum of that fact, finance, amount, and I want to multiply it by whatever the selected currency is on that day. So I'll grab my currency rate, and we'll just use the average rate because it makes my life easy. Now, there's one big thing that is incorrect about this. So if you see what I just did, it actually is not it's not translating correctly right now. And the reason is because you guys got to make sure that anytime you are using something like a SUMX, or you need to do any sort of iteration, that you're actually passing context. So we would actually want to say calculate this value. Just surrounding that function translates the row context generated by this table, and it applies it to this. Sorry, it applies it to this calculation. So now my values are actually going to change, and the values that are being displayed are now correct. So yeah, it's not exactly a many-to-many relationship, but we're using measurements from different tables that have many values and are handling many other values. So I've found this one ends up kind of in a similar boat there. Yeah.